It is. It's really, well. Look, it was lovely to see Tony again, and it's lovely to see you again, and talk about those early days, because we were sort of working on the radio at a similar time. And you tell us about your memories of how Struckhoff and I started, because you were both working as GPs, were you?
No, we met actually at house officers at Frenchay Hospital, the lovely Frenchay Hospital. Anyone been ill there? This year? And we did a hospital Christmas show, right, which is called the Wibbly Wobbly Spanky Botty Show. And this is a true story. It was in the hospital had a club then, and you were allowed, black humour was accepted in those days. Yeah. And I remember this is a true story, 2 student nurses working on a care of the elderly ward, and in front of a packed audience, they rewrote the lyrics of Merry Christmas Everybody by Slade, and the chorus went, so here it is, geriatrics, everybody's had a stroke. Let's get the turkey out and see how many choke. Now, if you did that now on a Christmas show, the Daily Mail would be on to you, you'd be banned. But in those days, you were allowed to laugh at human misfortune. And Tony and I met, and it was back in the day when we worked 120 hours a week, and for 80 of those, we got £1.20 an hour, and we'd kill patients and burn the notes and bury the x-rays and all that sort of stuff. And we thought, wouldn't it be funny to go as far away from Bristol as we can, i.e. Edinburgh, and tell all these stories on stage and see what happens. And I think we thought back then, we called ourselves Struckhoff and Die, because that was the best name we could come up with. Yeah.
It's and better than the Wibbly Wobbly, whatever the other one was.
Yeah, well, all medical shows have bad puns. So when I was a student, we were in Back Passage to India.
Okay.
There was Beverly Hills Plop. There was On Her Majesty's Secret Cervix. I mean, there was just... So Struckhoff and I was a step up.
Struckhoff and I was a good name.
And yeah, and we performed at the Celtic Lodge, which was an old Masonic hall at midnight, because we weren't known, so we couldn't get a really good slot, and just told terrible stories. And we had all these stickers printed. True stories. I remember an old lady coming into the emergency department who had a bit of a trouble down below, and I had to do an internal examination, a rectal examination, but I was very holistic, and I went up to the head end and explained what I had to do, and I remember popping a glove on and popping lots of jelly and very gently popping my finger in, and she lifted her head off the pillow and she said, "Is that you, George?" And it was, those sort of fairly standard fierce medico-political satire, save the NHS. And I think we thought through comedy we could save the NHS. We highlighted junior doctors' working conditions and how starving we were. You see these 80-hour shifts where you'd be so knackered, you wouldn't sleep for 80 hours, and there was no canteens in those days. You had no food. You had to patrol the wards like a gannet, trying to get your hands on any food you can. So one of the gags was that the reason we draw the curtains around a patient's bed when they've died is so the doctor can raid the fruit bowl without anybody noticing. So, bless them, Radio 4 came and recorded this show at midnight and then stuck it out the following year, sometime just after the Archers, and we got record numbers of complaints to the Broadcasting Standards Council, chaired by William Rees-Mogg, Jacob's father.
Yeah.
He was also a tosser, and he said... said it was inappropriate material for a comedy show, and back in the day, the BBC were absolutely delighted that we got so many complaints, and they said we were on the side of the angels, whatever. And then we got invited to the famous BBC Light Entertainment Christmas party at the Paris studios, and I remember walking down the stairs in between Frank Muir and the Beverley Sisters, or I think it was the Beverley Sisters, could be the Andrews Sisters, anyway, someone's sisters.
It was the Beverley Sisters.
And I spotted Ian Hislop, who was the new editor of Private Eye, and I followed him into the toilet, and I said, "Can I have a column in Private Eye?" And he said, "Do you mind not standing so close to me?" So I stepped aside and said, "Can I have a column?" And so then, after Struckhoff and I started writing for Private Eye, and so as well as satirising the NHS, we thought with investigative journalism we could save it, and we've done that for 35 years, and it's made absolutely no difference whatsoever. The NHS is in the worst state ever, and it must be my fault.
I think it probably is your fault for pointing these things out. And then giving the people stories and ideas on how they can make it worse.
Well, I did. I was asked to do an archive on 4 as part of the 75th anniversary of the NHS to reflect on this, and I called it How I Ruined Medicine. So it's the idea that, as well as doing the comedy stuff, I started exposing all these scandals, including the Bristol heart scandal, which was this massive scandal. And Tony and I originally broke the story on stage completely inappropriately. We said our local heart surgery unit is known as the Killing Fields and the Departure Lounge. which back in 1991 was considered highly amusing, and now we know that it led to the largest medical scandal, one of the largest medical scandals in history. It's not so funny, but even I realised then that just laughing about something on stage isn't going to change it. So I did at least write about it in Private Eye and try to change things. And then, because nobody listens to Private Eye, a bit like the Horizon Post Office scandal, the public inquiry was 8 years later. So I broke the story in 1992, and the public inquiry was in the year 2000. Right. And I was summoned to give evidence, which is the closest I've come to shitting myself, because you think... You know, you break all this stuff and you hide behind a pseudonym in Private Eye and you do some funny gags on stage. And then this was then the largest public inquiry in British history. And they had so much money thrown at it. And I step up there without any legal representation. And this chap said, Dr. Hammond, when you refer to the Bristol unit as the killing fields and the departure lounge, that's medical humour, is it? And I absolutely shat myself. And it was, fortunately, or rather sadly, the information that I was given. So there's a very brave whistleblower called Steve Bolson, who was an anaesthetist, who gave me information. In fact, Tony worked in the casualty unit with his wife, which is how I met him. And his information was true. So very sadly, it meant that at least 36 babies had died unnecessarily. Who wouldn't have died if they'd gone to Birmingham or Southampton. So it meant I wasn't going to be sued for getting it wrong. But it made me think about how we use humour, and we say you can make jokes about anything, but in the NHS, when you're making jokes about stuff like Adam Kay, you make jokes about stuff, but actually when things go wrong, people die. Yeah. And is that funny? And I'm still not sure what the answer to that is yet.
Yeah, well, it is interesting the way that through your own experience, things have changed. But it's also interesting that so many. There's a lot of comedians have started as doctors or stayed as doctors or were doctors for a while, and I think it's because and patients and a lot of comedians who've been through illnesses will then do shows about their illnesses. It's happening a lot now. Mine's the weakest of the many cancers that are on offer for you to come and see and stand up to.
Yours is funny.
Yeah, mine's the funniest.
Yours is funny because you live. Yeah, if you died, it wouldn't have been nearly so funny, and that's the thing, isn't it? It's a fine line between comedy and tragedy.
And balls are the funniest place to get cancer, so that's I was lucky for that. But it's the way, it's a coping mechanism, right? And I found it, as a patient, I found it very helpful to use humour to cope. And as a doctor, obviously, you're seeing these terrible things happening, you either have to go home and, presumably drink a lot and try and forget about it. Or...
To medical audience, when I'm talking to medical audience, I often say, do you think it's possible to be a compassionate doctor and nurse and have a sick or black sense of humour? And nearly everyone says yes. Yeah. In fact, it's partly essential for the job. I think what's changed is that in the old days, we would be quite brazen about it, and you'd tell these jokes on stage, and doctors would tell anecdotes about patients, and that's all gone now. It's almost been driven underground. People are frightened about being honest about what makes them laugh, and so they all do it in the privacy of the coffee room or whatever. I think Adam Kay was able to break the mold in a sense because he'd given up medicine by the time he wrote his diary and the televisation of it. He wasn't a doctor anymore, so he was allowed to do really black challenging humour that a practicing doctor probably couldn't. But there are some really good ones. Patrick, what's he called?
The anaesthetist.
Yeah. Yes. What's his second name? What's his second? You've had him on your book club. And you're going to edit it in. Edit his name in when this goes out. He's great.
Yeah, he's good.
Ed Patrick.
That's why you put it off.
Ed Patrick, the anaesthetist, is still practicing and does a slightly gentler type of humour. And there's a really another bloke called Benji Waterhouse.
Oh yes, yeah.
Who's a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And again, because he's still practicing, his humour isn't quite as aggressive. But he tells a really interesting story about somebody taking taking a paracetamol overdose, and they've taken 99 of the tablets. And he said to them, why didn't you take 100? And she said, well, I dropped one of them on the floor and I didn't want to get a dirty tummy from her. So he tells all these really odd psychiatric stories. So I'm glad, and I'm always really proud. People say, oh, are you jealous of Adam or jealous of what? And no, because we're almost like Russian dolls. There's Jonathan Miller at the start, and then Graham Garden and Graham Chapman. And then obviously Harry Hill, and Harry has said in podcasts he didn't do medical stuff because Struckhoff and I were already doing it, so he went his own way. In fact, I think of all the doctors who've become comedians, Harry is the one I most admire because of the breadth of his appeal is quite extraordinary. Yeah. So most doctors do slightly arsey, middle class, in the know, medical humour, and Harry appeals to everyone.
Yeah,
and
well,
I think that's a real
talent.
talent.
You know he was a doctor unless you knew he was a doctor.
But wow, wouldn't it be great to have him as a doctor?
It would be fantastic.
Joe Brand as your psychiatric nurse and Harry Hill as your doctor. That would be my dream ticket.
Well, I know Harry. I know at least one comedian who showed Harry his genitals in order to determine whether he had a sexually transmitted disease while backstage at a club. Did that ever happen? Did that happen to you? Were you called upon by?
I was the first year at Edinburgh. All the Irish comedians were coughing up blood. I remember I've always really loved Sean Hughes, but you always detected a slight vulnerability there. But yeah, sure. I'd occasionally have a chat with Sean. But yeah, the Irish comedians particularly would be coughing up blood and be malnourished, but much funnier than anyone else. Maybe that's a prerequisite for comedy.
I mean, the Fringe is the least healthy place. And certainly in the 90s, when you were mainly drinking and not eating or eating terrible food.
You must have drunk an absurd amount of alcohol.
I did.
I mean, that was the thing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, not terribly healthy. Anyway, there you go. Yes. Harry's memoir, I listen to Audible more than I read books now, particularly if the author is reading it. And Harry's memoir is wonderful. And like many comedians, I think he probably felt a bit depressed and isolated during COVID, and so did this memoir. And there's a wonderful story about him volunteering for frontline service. I mean, geez, he hadn't been a doctor for 20-odd years. And he phones up a woman at St. George's or wherever his nearest trust is who's never heard of Harry Hill, doesn't know who he is. And all she hears is the last ward he ever worked on was respiratory. So, okay, mate, you can start on Monday. And I think he was thinking of some sort of gentle reintroduction with maybe, shadowing someone. And she wants him straight back in the front line. And then he has to come up with some extraordinary excuse why he can't do it. But that's how desperate we were for doctors during COVID, that Harry Hill was fast-tracked to the respiratory front line.
I mean, would that be good? Would it be good to go out seeing Harry Hill? Harry Hill's face thinking, am I hallucinating?
The trouble is,
heaven?
He'd be wearing full PPE, so you wouldn't realise it was Harry Hill. What's the point of having a celebrity doctor if you don't?
The collars would give him away. That's
actually. He'd have special collars on his PPE. That would be good, yeah.